And welcome back. As we go ahead and continue looking at classes with Java, we have previously established how to make constructors, but now let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about them with how to overload a constructor. So let's first discuss this term overloading. Let's say we have two or more classes that have methods with the same name. For example, many classes have a method named toString. This is acceptable because the type of the calling object allows Java to decide which definition of the method toString you want to use. So for example, we had a date.toString and we had a myClass.toString. It's going to look at that identifier to determine which toString method you're talking about. And it's going to use whatever definition of toString is given in the definition of that class for that calling object. In fact, when two methods or more methods in the same class exist with the same name, you can do this. So we could have multiple different variations of a method, such as like setDate, and we call this overloading. Now there are some rules for overloading that we have to discuss. If we look at our date class, you'll see there's a total of 3 setDate methods. The headings of those methods are public void setDate, int month int day, int year. Public void setDate, string month string, int day, int year, and public void setDate, int year. You'll notice that each of these methods has a different parameter list. The first two methods differ by the first parameter, one's an int, one's a string, whereas the last differs from the other two by having a totally different number of parameters. Notice there's only one that we're looking at, which is the int year. So how does this affect our method signature? Well, the name of a method and the list of parameters in that heading of the method is what we call our method signature. So when we start looking at these, the signatures of each of these setDate methods would be setDate int int int, setDate string int int, and setDate int. When you overload a method name, each of the method definitions in the class must have a different signature, which means each of our parameters has to be unique in what we are passing into it. So if I had another setDate, let's say that I want to pass in just the month and date. That would be, I could do, for example, setDate int int, and that would be a valid method for overloading because it has a unique signature. Now, with overloaded methods, we can overload more than just, for example, our set methods. For example, we have a date OK that has been overloaded because there's actually two different methods that are named date OK in our date class. The signatures for those methods are date OK, int int int, and date OK, string int int. For each of the invocations of the method name setDate, only one of the arguments has a signature that matches the types of those arguments. And the same thing is going to apply to date OK. Now there is a pitfall to be aware of, which is overloading and automatic type conversion. Automatic type conversion of arguments such as int to double when a parameter is double and overloaded can sometimes interact in unfortunate ways. So if we look at this following method, public void increase double factor, year equals typecast int, and then year plus factor times year. What does this do? Well, let's look at this with a valid overload. All right, let's say we want to add the following definition into the class. So we have public void increase int term, year equals year plus term. This is, of course, what would be considered a valid overload because the two methods increase take different parameters of different types. So let me just zoom back real quick here and look at this one. You notice here we have a double, so this would be increase double. All right, so it's a different method signature. But then we look at this one, we have a increase int. So far, so good. With both of these methods named increase add to class, the following would behave differently. Date.increase2. However, you might already be seeing where we might have a potential issue here. If Java can, of course, find an exact match of types, it uses the method definition with an exact match before it tries to do any automatic type cases. So our method is now equivalent to date.year equals date.year plus 2 because it's going to use the int definition here. However, as you might have already figured out, we do have an issue that we need to look at. Let's just say a sample object is an object of type sample class. An invocation such as find will produce an error message because Java can't decide which overload definition of something to do. So sample object.do something 5, 10. So when Java looks at this, it might say, do we first want to convert that value to a double, or do we want the second one to be an int? In this situation, the compiler will, of course, give us an error message that the method invocation is ambiguous. So if you ever encounter this, it's because a lot of times it's some kind of type conversion that's going on that Java doesn't know. Are you referring to an integer or to a double, or some other situation similar to that where it's trying to convert and it doesn't know which conversion you want to use. Now, overloading, as a kind of our last note here, can be done both to methods and to constructors. Remember that constructors are really, you can think of them as specialized methods, or they're used to help create those objects. We talked about this last time. For example, having our no-arg constructors. Therefore, we overload both normal methods and constructors in a program as shown in the date class. And here we are in the date class again to take a look at those overloads. So we, of course, have seen this from our last example. So here's our constructors. We have our no-arg constructor. We have our various parameterized constructors here. All right. But again, keep in mind that this one is an int, int, int. This one is string, int, int. When we have one that's just int. And then, of course, we also have one that's taking in a date as a value. And if we go down a little bit further, you can see we have our 3 set dates here. So these, of course, are all overloads here. We have int, 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 string, int, int, and one for just a year. So again, you can do this to both constructors and to regular methods of your class. And if you remember, we also did one for date OK, where we have an int, 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 and one that is a string, int, int. Again, perfectly valid for us to be able to do because these are constructors and methods that we can overload with. Now, you can't overload everything. All right, so for example, if I want to look at my read input method, it probably doesn't make sense for me to have an overloaded version of read input because all we're using it to do is to get input to set variables. If I were to overload this, I'd have to be asking, why do I want to pass something in to this read input? Am I maybe, for example, going to use it to read an input and then store it to a file? I could do something like that. But generally speaking, you don't need to overload every method simply because you can. Stop to think about, do we need to overload? So for example, if we scroll down a little further and we start looking at some of our other methods in here, for example, set date and set year or set month, they're all right here. We don't need to create a different version of those because we don't have to see if there's some other variation. For example, we know that set day is going to just change the day instance variable to a new value of day. It's not going to perform some other type of action or pass in a different type of value. So these are the times when we look and say we don't need to overload. However, a lot of times you'll see overloading is when you have things, for example, like your constructors, because you might have different values that you're expecting to be typed in or to be passed into the class to be able to create those objects. Or things like your set methods, because you might say, maybe we want to set just the date, or maybe we want to set just the year, or maybe we want to be able to just set the whole date. So these are, of course, are things you have to think about when you're doing your programming.